For nearly 50 years, nobody suspected a thing. He was the kind of man you waved to every morning, friendly, quiet, always mowing his lawn before the sun even rose. He went by the name Robert Keller *. But that wasn't his real name. Not even close. To his neighbors in a small town in Pennsylvania, Robert was just another American retiree. A soft-spoken old man with a faint accent, who kept to himself and spent long hours tending to his roses. But buried deep in his past lay a secret the world wasn't supposed to find out. Robert Keller was once a KGB spy. It started decades earlier, in the heart of Moscow, during the tense years of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was locked in a silent war against the United States. No guns, no bombs. Just shadows, lies, and information. And in those shadows, the KGB thrived. His real name was *Alex Morozov ***. Born in 1931, in the outskirts of Leningrad, Alexei grew up in a world of fear and silence. His father was a soldier who never returned from the front. His mother, a nurse who believed loyalty to the motherland came before everything else, even love. When Alexei turned 20, he was recruited into a secret training program under the KGB's Illegals Directorate. Their mission was simple: blend in *. Disguise themselves as ordinary citizens of enemy nations. Build a new identity. And never, ever break cover. For years, Alexei trained to erase his past. He learned to speak English with an American accent, studied U.S. history, memorized pop culture references, and even learned how to complain about baseball like a true local. When the time came, he was given a new name, fake birth records, and a mission that would define the rest of his life. In 1958, Alexei Morozov vanished, and Robert Keller appeared in New York City. He got a modest apartment in Brooklyn, took a job at a printing company, and kept a small black notebook hidden behind the bathroom mirror. Inside it were coded notes, reports written in invisible ink, later to be developed using lemon juice and heat. Every few weeks, he'd visit a dead drop, a hollow tree in Central Park, where messages from Moscow waited for him. To anyone passing by, he was just another man feeding pigeons. But in reality, he was passing secrets, small pieces of information that could shift the balance of global power. He wasn't stealing nuclear codes or launching missiles. His job was quieter, but just as dangerous. The KGB needed data on the American economy, on political moods, and most importantly, on who was talking to whom. It was the era of paranoia. Every word, every handshake, every glance could mean betrayal. Alexei watched, listened, and blended. He married a woman named Carol, a kind-hearted schoolteacher who believed he'd grown up in Chicago. Together, they had 2 children. He took them to baseball games, paid taxes, and even joined the local Rotary Club. He became what his handlers called a deep sleeper, a spy who would wait patiently, maybe for decades, until the day his country called him back into action. But as the years passed, the mission changed. The Soviet Union was evolving, leaderships were shifting, and agents like him became ghosts, forgotten by the very system that created them. Still, Alexei, or Robert, continued living his double life, unsure whether Moscow even remembered him. Then came the 1980s, the Reagan years. America was roaring with confidence. And beneath the surface, intelligence agencies were at war like never before. The FBI had cracked several Soviet spy rings. Operation Ghost Stories was in motion. And whispers of illegals, deep-cover Soviet agents living as Americans, began to spread in Washington. Robert could feel the net tightening. Every time someone knocked on his door, he froze. Every time the phone rang unexpectedly, his heart skipped. He had grown old in America. His children spoke only English. They had American friends, American dreams. And somewhere deep inside, the line between who he was and who he had become began to blur. One winter night in 1987, a storm hit Pennsylvania. As Robert sat by the fire, his daughter asked him a simple question. "Dad, where are we really from?" He smiled but didn't answer. That night, he opened the old box he had kept hidden for decades. Inside, a faded KGB insignia, his original passport, and a letter written in Russian, sealed in wax. The letter had one line that haunted him. "When the time comes, you will know what to do." He hadn't heard from Moscow in almost 20 years. But now, as the Cold War neared its end, the silence felt heavier than ever. And that's when the knock came. A knock that would change everything. The man at the door wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't from the church or the post office. He was dressed in black, spoke softly, and handed Robert a small envelope. Inside, a photograph. A photograph of a young man standing outside the Soviet embassy in Washington. Written on the back were two words: "Find him." Robert froze. After all these years, his country had called him again. But what he didn't know was that this time, the KGB wasn't the only one watching. The FBI had been tracing signals, tracking patterns, and closing in on a mysterious man who seemed to live two lives. And soon, the quiet grandfather from Pennsylvania would become the center of one of the last great spy hunts of the Cold War. The photograph burned in Robert's mind. The young man in it looked familiar, sharp eyes, nervous posture, the kind of man who didn't belong in the open. He reminded Robert of himself decades ago, when he still believed in the cause. The note had said only two words: "Find him." For days, Robert couldn't sleep. Who was this man? Why now, after years of silence? He felt the past creeping up on him like an old shadow he could never escape. Finally, one morning before sunrise, Robert packed a small bag and left his quiet home behind. He didn't tell his wife where he was going. He simply said he needed to see an old friend. The roads were empty as he drove east toward Washington, the city that once symbolized everything he had sworn to destroy. By the time he arrived, the air was cold and heavy. He walked the streets with the kind of alertness only a spy could know. Every reflection, every stranger, every car mirror was a potential threat. He reached a small park across from the Soviet embassy. There, standing by a frozen fountain, was the young man from the photograph. Robert approached slowly. When their eyes met, the young man whispered, "It's you, isn't it, the old ghost?" Robert didn't reply. But he knew. The man was a new generation of agent, untested, reckless, full of pride. He introduced himself as Victor. He said Moscow had sent him to gather remaining contacts before the system fell apart. The Soviet Union was collapsing, and chaos was spreading through the KGB ranks. Some wanted to defect. Others wanted to burn every trace. Victor needed help to escape with a list, names of undercover operatives still buried deep in American life. If that list reached the wrong hands, dozens of lives would end. Robert realized this wasn't just another mission. It was a cleanup operation, a way to erase ghosts like him. He hesitated. For decades, he'd served a flag that had already stopped flying. He'd betrayed friends, built lies, raised a family on secrets. And now, in his old age, he was being asked to betray one last time. The two men met over the next few days in silence, in cafes, bus stops, and empty alleys. Robert taught Victor how to move without being followed, how to hide messages in plain sight, how to disappear in a crowd. But all the while, something felt off. He could sense another pair of eyes on them, invisible but close. He was right. The FBI had been monitoring encrypted radio bursts coming from Pennsylvania, traced back to his old neighborhood. Every transmission carried fragments of Russian code. And the source matched Robert Keller's old radio. The Bureau began surveillance quietly. An old man, they thought. Harmless. But what they didn't know was that he still remembered how to stay 2 steps ahead. Then one night, while Robert and Victor met under a bridge to exchange the final package, headlights flashed behind them. A voice shouted, "FBI, don't move." Everything went still. Victor panicked. He ran. Shots echoed in the distance, lights scattered, and in the chaos, the package fell to the ground. Robert didn't run. He simply raised his hands and whispered, "It's over." When they brought him in, agents were stunned by what they discovered. His fingerprints matched no American records. His birth certificate was fake. His accent, once flawless, cracked under stress, revealing hints of Russian beneath. Slowly, the truth unfolded. The kind old man from Pennsylvania had been living as a Soviet spy for over 40 years. But the story didn't end there. During interrogation, Robert never confessed fully. He spoke softly, always measured as if still performing. He said, "You spend your life believing in something, and when it's gone, what's left?" When asked about Victor or the list, he smiled faintly and said, "Some things should stay buried." Days later, the young agent Victor was never found. The list vanished. And before the FBI could file a full report, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was over. The world moved on. Robert Keller, or Alexei Morozov, was quietly deported to Russia in a secret exchange deal. He returned to a homeland that barely remembered him. A country that had changed beyond recognition. No parades, no medals, just a small apartment on the edge of Moscow and a garden with no roses. For the rest of his days, he lived alone, tending to his plants as he once did in Pennsylvania. Neighbors said he often sat by the window, staring out with a distant look, whispering to himself in English. They thought he was senile. But maybe he was remembering the only life that ever felt real. When he died in 2003, officials found a small wooden box beneath his bed. Inside, a faded American flag, a picture of his family, and a note written in trembling Russian. It said, "They taught me how to lie, but they never taught me how to forget." And that's the story of the grandfather who wasn't who he said he was. A man who lived between 2 worlds, never fully part of either. A soldier without a country. A spy who became the ghost of his own creation. The Cold War ended, but his story reminds us that sometimes the quietest lives hide the loudest secrets.